What's good, big girls? Welcome back into the BDGE Dynasty channel. Confession here. I've kind of been nerding out. I've actually been looking a lot at research. In particular, I've been taking a look at players' snap shares and kind of the role that they had last season, and sometimes even going back and looking at prior seasons, basically trying to get a handle, a really strong handle of the way that players are being deployed in the systems in the past, and then has the system overall in the offense changed going into this year, and has the personnel grouping changed as well. As I'm looking through these snap shares in 2023, a lot of times I'm looking at the player and their snap share overall throughout the season. You can see a window in which maybe it increased, or you kind of have a recollection, a strong recollection of how that took place in all the different dynasty leagues or fantasy leagues I'm playing in. But there are 5 players that I want to really talk with you about. It's kind of 5 players and situations that I want to talk about with you here today that realistically, these are giant outliers. And at the time, maybe there was a player that was getting a lot more opportunity and doing nothing with it, or vice versa, was doing a whole lot on the field, really efficient, but realistically, the volume wasn't there consistently week in and week out as far as opportunity goes. So what I want to do is go over these 5 players and situations with you. And ultimately, as we start to get into the redraft mindset and really starting to try to win a fantasy title at this point in the year, this is kind of what I'm starting to focus on, is really fine-tuning my dynasty team and trying to gear it up for the redraft mindset. So that also means it's time to start respecting your elders. Just because somebody's older, you don't view them very long, I don't really care if the short life is shelf, if this is a situation that's very steady or that we can project to be a value. And while I'm trying to win a whole bunch of these leagues, we'll see if actually any of that comes to fruition. But I'm trying to prep at least to go get ready to win a title. So if you want to do that, you know what we got to do. Let's tuck them, man. Tuck these damn shirts in. Stop yapping. It's time to eat. When I'm looking at the 2023 data, I'm basically looking to see at the position, were there any outliers or some players that had a whole lot more or less opportunity than maybe I quite remember? Is this somebody that's maybe going to return value to you? And then also, are there some players that really are starting to give me some red flags where I don't really love the situation or what I can confidently project at least going into the season? So when I'm taking a look at the wide receivers from last year that are basically playing or on the field for almost all the snaps, extremely high snap share. And right away, Alec Pierce playing on 95% of their team snaps last season throughout the entire year. And also from a raw snaps perspective, this guy played on 1,090 snaps, which led the NFL at the wide receiver position. I remember he had a couple pop weeks where he returned value. Gardner Minshew basically hit him for some long touchdowns. He wasn't anything ridiculous, but he was top 25, I think, in 2 weeks last year. But for the most part, I mean, this is a guy that's literally just on the field existing, just taking up air, doing absolutely nothing. And when you take a look at what he did last year, Alec Pierce is actually a pretty good run blocker. So that was one thing that the Colts trusted him to do. Basically with Alec Pierce, they were sending him a lot of really deep routes, almost using him more as a decoy because Gardner Minshew checked the ball down. He was someone that did not push the ball downfield relative to the quarterback position. He was towards the bottom of the NFL as far as what his average depth of target was. But point here with Alec Pierce is I'm looking at this type of role and the fact that they want to have a guy on the field this often. Now, Josh Downs is their slot receiver and is going to continue to occupy that role in that 60+% snap share range. But the point that I'm making here is basically about Adonai Mitchell and Alec Pierce. Going into this year, the Colts have already come out and said that Alec Pierce and Adonai Mitchell are competing for that starting outside job on the opposite side of Pittman. But I think in the big picture for the Colts, you obviously can't be loving the fact of Alec Pierce's production throughout 2 years, especially last year, given how much he was on the field. So at this point, I think the idea is that they take a guy like Adonai Mitchell, who is an extremely athletic player. You put him on the opposite side of Michael Pittman. Michael Pittman, a very strong possession receiver, at least the way that they're using him in that offense. Then you have a great running game that the defense is going to have to put a lot of focus and attention on guys like Jonathan Taylor and Anthony Richardson. And then you have Josh Downs, who's a very good route runner, kind of occupying the middle of the field and keeping defenses honest there. And when we look at this situation going into this year for Adonai Mitchell, does he take this job from Alec Pierce right away? Is Alec Pierce and him splitting that position? I think for dynasty purposes, you want to see Adonai Mitchell take this role from Alec Pierce. And if he's someone that can get a very high percentage of snaps, I think he's actually going to be someone that gives you a decent floor as far as earning targets, but then ultimately has some really high upside if A-Rich can stay healthy in an offense where he can take the top off of defenses. So, and with Adonai Mitchell going later than we were hoping for to the Colts, that wasn't the greatest for me. And I was kind of looking at the landing spot like, can Anthony Richardson support 3 weapons in this offense? But when I take a look at the way they were deploying Alec Pierce, the fact that they did use a second-round pick on Adonai Mitchell, Ballard talking very highly of him, I think Adonai Mitchell is really intriguing for me in this offense that I think that could be, with A-Rich at the helm, taking a huge step forward in fantasy football. At the tight end position, did you know there was only one player that throughout the entire season, every single game, when you factor them all in, played over 90% of their team snaps. And unless you just recently were studying up on your snap percentages, Cade Otton is not a name you were expecting me to tell you. Cleaned the field as far as opportunity goes, being on the field. And with all that volume, Cade Otton essentially was just existing. All those damn snaps. He had 1 week where he was inside the top 10 at the position, and it took him getting into the end zone twice. He did have 70 yards that week, but he had 1 week inside the top 10 where he finished tight end 3. Essentially every single week he's playing and the only really tight end on the field consistently for the Bucs. He did nothing for you. And if you kept playing him, he was giving you weeks like tight end 12, tight end 15, which I guess overall isn't that horrible relative to the field, but ultimately none of these weeks are helping you win football games in fantasy. You're not even really having the safest floor for a guy that's out there that often. And it's really just insane. But when you look at Cade Otton and Alec Pierce, those are two massive outliers as far as people that are actually playing an insanely high amount, but essentially just existing, doing absolutely nothing with them. The reason I'm talking about Cade Otton is not to really discuss the tight end position for the Bucs. I think overall, the tight end position is essentially the exact same thing that they had last year as far as bodies piled up behind Cade Otton. Even with all that opportunity, he really didn't carry much upside. He was essentially a touchdown-dependent top 10 tight end with all that volume. Losing Dave Canales could end up being a negative for this offense, but the consolidated volume that's going to Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, and then Rachaad White, we'll see what happens with him and Bucky Irving and how their snap share goes. But overall, really you're looking at a very consolidated offense in the way that they're running this system. When you look at last year, 136 and 130 targets going to those wide receivers, and then Rachaad White was third on the team. That type of consolidated volume you really like to see. So when I take a look at a team for fantasy, and I can say that I just don't care about the tight end unless it's super late in drafts and like a best ball draft and you just have to put a body in there, maybe I would draft Cade Otton there. But overall, I'm basically not going to be looking at the tight end position right now for the Bucs. And unless something drastic changes and all of a sudden Cade Otton is on the field a ton, and this time he's earning targets from Baker Mayfield, I can't really see that changing drastically. So for me, Cade Otton's a fade, but it actually starting to get me a little more in on a guy like Chris Godwin. I think with Mike Evans, you could end up having a league winner still at the receiver position for another year or two. Now, one of these players, I did know that the snap share was a little concerning last year, an extremely talented player that I do have high hopes for, and I think if the snap share was to increase, this player, Jayden Reed, is extremely talented. But as I'm starting to dig into the specifics of Jayden Reed, and really the way that this team is utilizing him, the way that they're running their offense, and the lack of flexibility that they're viewing or deploying Jayden Reed with in all of last season. But when I take a look at this offense and the continuity they have in Green Bay from last year, and I really start to look and comb over this information, starting to make me not really love Jayden Reed currently at cost, especially because I'm drafting him pretty clearly as the wide receiver 1 value-wise in this offense in Green Bay. And I want to have a lot of attachment to this offense. The way that Jordan Love was playing, in particular, like the second half of the year, he was someone that had a command of this offense, and I think this offense is going to be very fantasy relevant. It's basically trying to pinpoint which of these receivers is actually going to try to separate themselves for us in fantasy football that we can say is the wide receiver 1 or has the most upside. Now, Jayden Reed last year, when you take a look at his metrics, extremely efficient, but he had 10 touchdowns and basically efficiency on volume that's not extremely high at the position is not really something you want to chase. Touchdowns are not a sticky metric year in, year out. Basically, when you compare Jayden Reed last year to the field, he played less snaps on the season than Chris Moore, Cedric Tillman of my Cleveland Browns, which honestly, it didn't even feel like he was playing any snaps. He was just out there existing as well. Devontae Parker, recently retired, and then Rashid Shaheed. Jayden Reed played less snaps for the season than all 4 of those players, and 86 receivers in the NFL played on a higher snap percentage for their team than Jayden Reed. Jayden Reed was a 56% snap share player across the entire season. And basically when I take a look at Jayden Reed and kind of compare him relative to the other receivers in this room, and then ultimately to the way that they're running their offense and the kind of the personnel packages the Packers are running with Jayden Reed. Jayden Reed had 2 weeks where he was over 70% of snaps. And when you take a look at that, comparing Jayden Reed in those 2 weeks where he was over 70% of snaps to, firstly, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs. Initially, when I'm looking at that, I'm like, that's a good thing. Basically, all 3 of these guys can coexist with opportunity. And maybe actually as the season progresses, maybe Jayden Reed can start to push some of the snap share down for a guy like Romeo Doubs or Christian Watson somewhere. But then when you start to compare to the tight end position and basically the way that they're running their offense. Last year, Green Bay, as far as personnel, they were third in the NFL running 12 personnel. With 12 personnel, you have 2 tight ends out there. And basically, that's also a big thing for Green Bay to talk about last year in the draft. They not only drafted Luke Musgrave, they doubled down and drafted Tucker Kraft. Luke Musgrave started off hot of those 2 as the tight end 1 for this offense. And then when he got hurt, Tucker Kraft took over a huge amount of snaps. And the Packers are running over 30% of the time out of a 12 personnel package. And basically, when you look at what they're doing is 11 personnel when they're going to have 3 wide receivers out there, the slot role for Jayden Reed. Last year, over the entire season, 63% of the time they're running 11 personnel. Primarily, if Jayden Reed is going to be used exclusively or almost exclusively out of the slot. But then when you take a look at those 70% weeks, Green Bay was in situations where they were running more 11 personnel. And basically, the increase in snaps for Jayden Reed in those 70% range, it came at the expense of the tight end position, not at the expense of Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson. Basically, I'm starting to comb over this information further, and I'm kind of comparing all the players in the Packers offense on a weekly basis throughout the entire year. You start to think about their season. Going into week 18, they needed to win that week to secure the playoff spot, and they're playing the Chicago Bears. Now with their season on the line here, Romeo Doubs ends up leaving extremely early, so he only plays 18% of snaps, and they already had Christian Watson not there. Basically, his snap share, Jayden Reed, did not change at all. He was deployed in that exact same role, and that's where Bo Melton and Dontavian Wick's snap share went up on the outside. So realistically, unless right now in the offseason, they're planning to use him in a completely separate role than what they used last year, I'm getting pretty concerned about Jayden Reed actually taking a step forward into the snap share department to where it's not just having to chase this efficiency, because I do think the player is extremely talented, but is he going to get that increased snap share where he's not towards the bottom of the NFL receivers, guys that you don't really want to roster in fantasy? Basically, at that point, all you can have is him having to continue to be hyper efficient and return touchdowns week in and week out. Not that he wasn't being targeted a lot in the red zone, but that's just not something you can expect week in and week out if he's only playing 60% of the snaps. And I already kind of knew before looking over this information that Jayden Reed was going to have to earn the trust of this Packers offense to really get a higher percentage of snaps. But when you start to think about the way that they're going to run things, and realistically going into Jordan Love's second year and the second year of the same offensive coordinator for the Packers now, and there's really nothing that I can now project and say that's going to change in this offense, or unless they're going to be viewing Jayden Reed much differently than they did last year in the way that they ultimately deploy him. I do objectively think he is extremely talented, but I really have nothing that I can concretely point to and even talk about that the Packers are saying that he's going to play in the slot every chance he gets. But when it comes down to these 2 receiver sets, Jayden Reed's going to be a guy they trust on the outside. Ultimately, that really has me concerned when I'm trying to bet on who is going to be the wide receiver 1 in this Packers offense. Now, sticking with the same theme here with Jayden Reed, Jaylen Warren, when you take a look at his efficiency, yards created, number 7 in the NFL. Yards created per touch, number 3. Basically, when given the opportunity, did really well and had a very good true carry rate, as well as had multiple plays last year. You probably remember having really long runs to the house. And when you have a guy with that type of efficiency that you're basically trying to now project getting more volume because he's doing so well with the opportunity he's given, that's, I think, kind of been the story for Jaylen Warren. Last year, when you take a look at the whole season, Jaylen Warren was actually 48% of the snaps last year with Najee Harris. Jaylen Warren only in 1 week was over 60% of snaps. And I'm not saying he's the type of player that needs to have high 60% of snaps to be a very good running back in the NFL. That would put him towards the top last year when you take a look at the way that the running backs are being deployed now in the NFL. But here's the thing, if he's going to be less than 50% of snaps, and now with Arthur Smith coming over, when you take a look at Najee Harris, I think Arthur Smith is going to continue to give him at least that 55, maybe even closer to 60% of snaps. And it's not that Jaylen Warren can't be efficient with the touches, but when you're drafting him inside the top 30 at the running back position, I feel like right now I don't really see the upside for Jaylen Warren at this price outside of a Najee injury, or if Arthur Smith and everything we know about him is all of a sudden going to be giving the ball to a guy that's 5'8", 207 over Najee Harris. I just have a hard time believing that's going to be the case. Now this year with Russ at the helm, it's not necessarily going to be the most fun to watch them as far as being an offensive juggernaut, but it's going to be better than it was with Kenny Pickett the last 2 years and what they've done over the last 2 years to address the offensive line. This could end up being a spot where Najee Harris, he's not going to get that crazy high volume that he did in his rookie season. And basically, Najee Harris is a little bit capped from being that ridiculously elite player he was early because he's not going to get that elite passing work because of the presence of Jaylen Warren. but I do think that he's going to still be the 1A in this offense. And realistically, I don't want to draft Jaylen Warren because he's a little on the younger side. When I look at his situation, outside of a Najee injury, I don't really project him to be someone that I confidently am going to be starting in my lineup on a weekly basis. Why wouldn't I just draft some of these older running backs that I feel more confident about their role in a year or two window than I do with Jaylen Warren? And basically, when I think about Jaylen Warren, one of the biggest selling points ultimately comes down to this. How am I going to use Jaylen Warren in my roster construction? If I have him on my team, when do I feel confident that I'm going to start Jaylen Warren and put him into my lineup and just have it as a set it and forget it? It's definitely not a set it and forget it. And when I start to think about penciling in weekly assessment of Jaylen Warren, nothing in his log last year really is predictive, at least for me, when I'm looking at, okay, now I'm going to be starting Jaylen Warren. There was a time, I think probably, where fantasy managers are looking at weeks 8, week 9, and week 10. In those 3 weeks, Jaylen Warren was running back 15, running back 8, and then was running back 2 versus Cleveland. In that Cleveland game, he had that 74-yard run I was talking about. So when you look at that, you're kind of saying, okay, now Jaylen Warren is going to take over this running back room for the Steelers, and that really didn't happen. And basically, overall, when you look at his game log, he had only a handful of games in which he had over 10 carries. And when you look at the snap share, it's definitely not high enough for me to say, all right, maybe last week was a fluke. And when you look also of those weeks where he was running back 8, running back 2, and running back 11, he had a touchdown on the ground in those weeks, and he doesn't have enough on the goal line for me to project when that's going to happen. I take a look at last year per player profiler, Jaylen Warren red zone touches, 24 overall, which is 38th in the NFL. He had 3 goal line touches. And one thing I can almost guarantee is Najee Harris, and that size he has, is going to be Arthur Smith's back of choice. And basically, unless it's in one of these situations late in the game and they're going no huddle, trying to catch the team off guard, and they have Jaylen Warren on the goal line already, that's what's currently the package out there. I can almost guarantee you anything, Najee, he's going to be Arthur Smith's back of choice at the goal line. And basically when I'm starting to think about that, the presence of Najee Harris still being there, and the way that I think that they're going to use Jaylen Warren, given everything that we know about this offensive situation, I don't think he's going to be the type of running back that I want to roster, because right now I think his standalone value for me anyway is a little murky as far as what weeks I'm going to be starting him. Sure, if there was an injury to Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren at that point would be somebody I would love to start week in and week out. I'm hoping at that point his snap share would get a lot higher. But right now, Najee Harris isn't a guy that I feel like I can confidently say is going to miss X amount of weeks throughout the season. And then at that point, Jaylen Warren will be taking over the starting role. And because that's the case, Jaylen Warren for me, given the snap share under 50%, and really I don't think this offense is also going to be one of the most high-powered offenses in the league, and I just want to have a bunch of pieces in this offense. I do think it's going to be a little more run-heavy with Arthur Smith, but I just don't feel confident enough in Jaylen Warren's workload relative to other running backs that are going in the range of him at this point. Which brings to the 5th and final player. So one of the things that has just stayed the same over the years when I look at snap shares and really the way in which he's being deployed over a long period of time, and I'm rocking his jersey today, Alvin Kamara, right now, I get it. We're looking at the efficiency and we say it's just dipped off. At this point, he's getting older. He's probably hit the age cliff. He's just not as talented, as efficient as a running back. And what I want to do is actually kind of go over several things with Alvin Kamara to really paint the picture why I think he's probably in extreme value. I mean, the thing with Kamara is you shouldn't be projecting him really more than a single year out at this point in his career. And really what I want to do is kind of give you the overall theme and kind of comparing his snap share, his situations. It started to make sense why I think the community is souring a little bit on him. Obviously, age is something that's going to scare off anybody, in particular in a running back position, which is a short shelf life in general. And this offense and everything about this team has changed so much over the years. But what I want to do is just kind of give you an idea of what should we expect and what have we expected from Alvin Kamara in snap share in his career. So just taking a look at last year, all this information here with snap shares is coming off of Fantasy Pros, their website. So in 2023, obviously he was coming off the suspension. He missed the first 3 games. But from week 4 on, overall for the entire season, when you factor all of it in, he was playing 63% of the team snaps at the running back position. Now, one of the things to ultimately keep in mind as well is this isn't the NFL of old. In some of the early days when Alvin Kamara was playing, basically that 63% of snaps relative to the field earlier in Alvin Kamara's career felt like you're bleeding a lot of opportunities, and at that point you really need him to be hyper efficient. But last year that 63% of snaps was actually tied for 11th at the running back position as far as snaps and opportunities on the field. So while that 63% of snaps doesn't really necessarily sound that high, this current stage of the NFL, the way that most teams are deploying the running back position, that's actually a really good snap percentage, 63%. So when you take a look at that and you think about, obviously last year, it felt like his efficiency was really bad as far as a runner in between the tackles. Feels like he's kind of lost a step. And the thing that's really catapulting and keeping his value high in fantasy is the fact that he's getting so many of these dump off passes. Last year, he had 77 targets. So that's 5th in the NFL over the whole season. Obviously, that doesn't even bake in the fact that he missed the first 3 games. Then you think about him getting 57 catches. That's 7th in the NFL. That really raises in PPR formats his floor and basically why he was so good over the course of the season last year when he played. And I get all that, but realistically, what has changed? We're talking about this situation for Alvin Kamara. Go to 2022. He played 69% of snaps. 2021, actually, the highest he played over his career. He played 75% of snaps in that season. 2020, he played 65% of snaps. 2019, 68% of snaps. 2018, 66% of snaps. You got to go back to 2017, where he played 45% of snaps over the course of the season. He started to earn more of that 60% snaps as the season progressed. You may not remember, but in the early part of that year, Adrian Peterson actually was on the team early, and there was a lot of weeks early on before they got rid of him, and they started really using Alvin Kamara in a much heavier workload where he was playing like 20% of the snaps. But the point is, overall, Alvin Kamara's career is in this range. This is what he's been on the field for. This is the role that we've seen from him. Nothing's changed in his role. Now, going back to Alvin Kamara's rookie season in 2017, towards the end of the year, he was a complete league winner. This is a guy that ended up finishing the season on that little percentage of snaps, 44.4% of team snaps that year, 37th in the NFL, but finished as the number 4 overall fantasy points per game running back in the league. That basically obviously is going to lead to massive efficiency when you take a look at his efficiency, true yards per carry, yards per touch, all these things, breakaway run rate. The guy was insane in his rookie season, right? And then you take a look at 2018, 2019, 2020. Over the course of those seasons, certain efficiency metrics for him were up and down. There was some time throughout those years where he was a little more banged up and dealing with some injuries, which ultimately affected his efficiency as well. But what I really want to get to here is in this 2020 season. You take a look at 2020, he was actually on a true yards per carry 11, yards per touch number 2. Basically this really hyper efficient Alvin Kamara that we're used to seeing. The way that he runs his style is just so different. Overall throughout his career, from 2017 to 2020, you're used to seeing this really hyper efficient and unique style of play that just gets it done for fantasy in a really big way. But if you take a look now going into the 2021 season, you start to see that this efficiency like falls off a cliff. And realistically, just what we think and know about the running back position is what? You start to get older and your motor goes. You don't have that same first step. You're getting old. We don't want you anymore, right? We don't trust you. And you start to see this as a theme. Then in 2021, now I'm going to get into the specifics of that season, but you go to 2022. The efficiency does come up a little bit here, but overall, not the old Alvin Kamara we're used to seeing. He did end up being running back 8 in that season overall, but then look at this last year, again, the efficiency was not the greatest, especially in between the tackles. So now thinking about all that information, I really want to get into the specifics with you here as to why this could be the case. Now, I'm not trying to tell you a 29-year-old or 28-year-old last year Alvin Kamara is the same type of bursty player that he was in the 2017 season. So I'm not making that case. However, what I do want to do is break down the situations and how wildly different they are, given what Alvin Kamara was dealing with in the earlier part of his career. When you take a look, obviously Drew Brees is going to be the quarterback at the helm for those first 4 years, 2017, 18, 19, and 20, for Alvin Kamara. One, he loves to check the ball down and had this offense in a much different situation. This was a very good team in the NFL under Drew Brees. But then ultimately, what do we know about the running back position? Even if you are a pass catcher, someone that's going to be running through the tackles, even that guy, as much as Alvin Kamara is, the offensive line is going to be creating a lot of your opportunity. And ultimately for the running back, it's extremely hard to play way better than your offensive line is providing for you. And when you take a look at Alvin Kamara in the 2019 season, starting from that point, this was the 5th offensive line grade in PFF in that 2019 season. Then you take a look, that's really great. A top 5 offensive line is going to allow Alvin Kamara to feast both in the passing game and in the rushing game, especially considering Drew Brees was there and the way that this offense was built at that time. That grade of 5th in the offensive line was really based on these really 2 strong offensive linemen at the tackle spots in particular. You could argue at that time, one of the best duos, if not the best duo, at the left and right tackle. They had that same thing going into 2020, Terran Armstead being such a dominant force at left tackle. They were 8th in the 2020 season with Drew Brees at the helm as an offensive line grade. So now with Drew Brees out of town, we have quarterback inconsistency and uncertainty. You had Jameis Winston playing some of the snaps, but if you remember, the large majority of the time at the helm was Taysom Hill. And part of the thing when you look at the splits with Taysom Hill was not a guy that obviously wanted to check the ball down. This is a guy that ended up wanting to take off and run. And then overall, when you think about that in the 2021 season, that was the year that Alvin Kamara returned as little as he ever did as a running back as far as receptions go. And then now you have, on top of that, in the 2021 season, this offensive line started to deteriorate. Terran Armstead has an injury, only plays 8 games, and then overall they finished 18th as an offensive line. One of the things with the Saints overall, they are being really poorly run. It's basically a team that's like using credit card and just paying off the interest and constantly trying to find a way to continue to compete with this team that's really void of talent. They're not willing to rebuild, and not only are they not willing to rebuild, they've really leveraged a lot of their future picks. This team is not very well built, and Alvin Kamara is now running behind in 2022 the 29th offensive line in the NFL. They have Andy Dalton at the helm. And while obviously a guy like Alvin Kamara is a nice safety blanket for Andy Dalton, a bad offensive line and Andy Dalton at this point in his career, Alvin Kamara is not going to be able to offer that same efficiency in this offense as he did in his years prior, where he probably was more young and spry, and the offensive line was actually creating holes for him. Really nothing changed this last year. In the 2023 season, this is the 23rd offensive line. They had a first-round pick that's busted. They don't have a lot of continuity, and they don't have a strong offensive line. And when you think about the offensive line not creating that same situation for Alvin Kamara with really big holes, it makes sense why we haven't seen that Alvin Kamara with the 2 different shoes on from Christmas Day in that 2020 season. We don't have the same offense around him. But what we do have is he's going to be playing with everything that we can project a similar percentage of snaps where it's in the 60% range. They did draft Kendre Miller and use decent draft capital on him, but realistically what we can project from him, I don't even think in this point in his career, Alvin Kamara is someone that you can't say is going to be playing in that mid to high 60% of snaps. And at this point in this offense with Derek Carr there, last year, remember, he was banged up. And I'm not saying that Derek Carr is going to become a world beater, but at this point, Derek Carr is someone that does like to check the ball down. I think that you can still safely project Alvin Kamara to have a very nice floor as far as target goes, and realistically is going to give you, while not super and hyper efficient, he's going to give you enough volume that he's going to return value to your teams, I think, for another year. And I also think Alvin Kamara is going to be someone that we will see continue to typically age gracefully relative to the running back position because of the style of play he has and the traits, because he does have that pass catching prowess. So Alvin Kamara, really nothing's changed other than a lot of the situation around him, I think. Certainly he's getting older. He's not the same player and talent he once was in years past, but I don't think a lot of it is as much Alvin Kamara as it is this Saints offense and team just isn't the same as what we've seen in the past. So I'm confidently still using Alvin Kamara in redraft and as well in Dynasty for another year. And I'm basically valuing him in my Dynasty leagues as a 1-year bet moving forward. So that's all I got. Let me know what you thought of this video, kind of breaking all these situations down and why overall some of these situations are some outliers I think that we should be aware of, whether that is a good or bad thing. And then ultimately Alvin Kamara, sometimes stability is good. Let me know what you thought of this video. See you back here, same time, same place next week. I'm out of here.